Hello.
Hi. In our last segment, we were in Genesis 12, 1-3, the so-called Abrahamic Covenant, although at the time he was still called Abram. He hadn't been transformed. But in that sequence of verses, 3 verses, you have from the individual Abram to the blessing of all nations, all families of nations, actually, is the way it's worded. Mm-hmm. Encompassed in 3 verses. But then there's the, how is this going to work? Yeah. Abraham and the patriarchs don't know.
It's not really explained. Yeah.
If you want to see this, the how of it, how is this going to happen? That from one man comes the blessing of all families of the earth. Deuteronomy 4, before Moses dies, he lays before Israel the plan, such as it was revealed at that point. So why don't we read Deuteronomy 4, select verses, and see how it's developed.
Okay. And now, O Israel, listen to the regulations and the judicial decisions that I am teaching you to do, in order that you may live, and may indeed go in and take possession of the land that Jehovah, the God of your forefathers, is giving you. You must not add to the word that I am commanding you, neither must you take away from it, so as to keep the commandments of Jehovah your God, that I am commanding you. See, I have taught you regulations and judicial decisions, just as Jehovah my God has commanded me, for you to do that way in the midst of the land to which you are going to take possession of it. And you must keep and do them, because this is wisdom on your part, and understanding on your part, before the eyes of the peoples who will hear of all these regulations. And they will certainly say, this great nation is undoubtedly a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has gods near to it, the way Jehovah our God is in all our calling upon him? And what great nation is there that has righteous regulations and judicial decisions like all this law that I am putting before you today? Only watch out for yourself and take good care of your soul, that you may not forget the things that your eyes have seen, and that they may not depart from your heart all the days of your life. And you must make them known to your sons and to your grandsons.
So how does Moses see this blessing being transmitted to all peoples? Mm-hmm. And here's where it gets interesting. If you tuned into Watchtower Myth number 1 series, we exploit the thought in those videos that this assumption that this happens by evangelism, by someone preaching the good news of the kingdom to all the world. Well, that phrase, of course, is in the mouth of Jesus in Matthew 24, but here's the original concept of how this blessing will be transmitted.
And there's no evangelism here. But there is envy. The nations look on and see a difference between what these people seem to have and what the other nations don't have or have.
Even in the New World Translation, if you look at verses 6, 7, and 8, you see the phrase great nation 3 times.
Right.
And in the first case, it's in the mouth of the other nations, the other peoples.
The eyes of the peoples who will hear of all these regulations, and they will certainly say that they're wise and understanding people.
Okay, so the Gentiles are going to notice what the Jews have that they don't have, and this will create an envy. Mm-hmm. And then Moses gives us the explanation of how they came to have what the other nations don't have.
Yeah.
And he explains it as being, what other nation is there? It's a form of a question. What other nation is there that has a God nearby?
That's close, that they can call upon.
That they can call upon.
And he hears them.
If you've seen the Divine Name series and 1 or 2 of the other series, you realize too that this is the very meaning of the name Yahweh. Mm-hmm. The great theologians like Ayler and Davidson have told us from the days of Russell and beyond, they've been telling us that the name Yahweh in Hebrew connotes a God who reveals himself That is, he appears, as he did to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. A God who reveals himself in word as well as pictorially, as a manifestation, or the Greek word would be epiphany. An epiphany of God, an appearance of God, accompanied by verbal revelation. Isn't that what the nations even acknowledge?
Yeah, right.
When they talk about laws and statutes in verse 6, and then Moses reiterates that thought. In verse 8, what great nation is there that has statutes and judgments as righteous as this whole law which I am setting before you? So it's interesting that even by the New Testament, if you read the Gospels looking for this, you'll notice right away there's significant Gentiles who are now attached to the Jewish synagogues throughout the Roman Empire. This has already started to happen, despite them being in exile, or maybe you could even say because of them.
Yeah, I think that's
exile.
the way it works out, is that they're scattered in judgment, and in that scattering, they're mixing with Gentiles. And the Gentiles are becoming aware of the difference about these people to other peoples.
And that's a miracle in itself that we should talk about in a series of its own, because this couldn't have happened unless the synagogue had started, and the synagogue couldn't have started unless they were in exile, because this was a desperate measure to bring about the fulfillment of this.
When we were talking about it earlier, we talked about that familiar verse that the witnesses use, the Zechariah 8:1. I have heard, that we use it to apply to us. We have heard that God is with you, but it was being applied to them.
The Jews were being seen as different, and they were now different only because they had to protect themselves, and this is a realization they only really came to after 1,000 years of living in the Promised Land. Most of them had to leave the Promised Land and lose Jerusalem and lose the temple to bring this about, this realization that we have to be different. We're called to be different. Now, when we get to verse 10, in the next segment, we'll see just how that difference was made personal, how that was made. The difference was now on a family level in Judaism, as opposed to what it had been before, just a cult with a certain system of worship and a certain name to the God that was different than others. Now it became real. And verse 10, I think, gives us the secret of how that was to happen in the next segment.